So let's recall our bead sampling activity. We sampled, using our little paddles, we sampled red and white beads, and we did samples of size 20 and samples of size 100, and we saw results that kind of look like this. These were the samples of size 20 and the samples of size 100. So what are some of the lessons that we can learn from our bead sampling activity? First of all, I want to talk about two purposes for using random sampling. One was one we discussed earlier. We want to avoid bias. We found when we did the Federalist Papers activity that if we choose our own sample, or maybe if we use a voluntary response sample or a convenience sample, that our results will probably systematically over or underestimate the response variable because we're not getting a sample that is representative of the population. So using random samples gives us a sample that is representative of the population. But there's a second reason. When we sample randomly, the laws of probability tell us how we can expect our sample statistics to vary from the actual population parameter. Now, if we look at the dots here, we see that these aren't just scattered all over the place. They're kind of clumped together. We see that there's a predictable pattern of variation. We have most of our results were kind of clustered towards a middle value with a little spread on either side. When we took samples of size 100, we saw that the variability was less, but there was this predictable looking pattern. We know that all samples vary from the population because each sample varies from each other and from the population because we know they're not going to be exactly alike. This variability is called sampling error. Sampling error is not a bad thing. That's just another name for variability. That's not the same as bias, which is a systematic under or overestimating the response variable. Here, the response variable that we're looking for is probably about right in the middle of the data. Our population parameter is probably right in the middle here, and our samples vary on either side in a very predictable way. And as a matter of fact, we have something called a margin of error. We can see that there is a predictable amount of variability. And the margin of error sets bounds on what we can expect that amount of variability to be. Another lesson we learned from our bead sampling activity is that statistics taken from larger random samples vary less than statistics taken from smaller random samples from the same population. So they give us better information about the population. So when we took samples of size 100, we got estimates with less variation than we did when we took samples of size 20. Now, another way to reduce variability besides taking larger samples is to use a stratified sample. We learned that when we did the jelly blubber activity because our stratified samples had less variability than the other sampling methods like cluster, simple random sample, or systematic that we tried. So here, those are some helpful things we've learned about inference for samples. Now, the last section of the book talks about what can go wrong. It's just kind of a review of the different types of bias that we have. So let's think about the types of bias. Two types of bias we have come when we are choosing the sample. One of them is failure to use randomization. This is when we use a voluntary response, when people get to self-select themselves into the sample, or when we use convenience or judgment samples. If we're doing any of those types of sampling methods, we are not using any randomization, so that introduces bias into our results. The other type of bias that we could have when we're choosing a sample is called undercoverage. Undercoverage could occur with any of those sampling methods mentioned above. Because what happens is that a group is systematically, a portion of the population is systematically, this should say excluded, not included, excluded from the sample. So the group from which the sample is drawn, even if it's a random sample, which is called the sampling frame, doesn't equal the population of interest. So we saw this in the Literary Digest poll. So if we are trying to sample all adult voters, but we only pick in 1936 people who own televisions, cars, or not televisions, telephones, cars, or subscribe to a rather highbrow literary magazine, we're getting under coverage because we're primarily asking wealthy people. And so so a portion of the population, the less wealthy people, were systematically excluded from the sample, and the sample results turned out to be very bad indeed. Now, those two things happen while we're taking the sample in the sampling process. But there are two other kinds of bias that can happen after the sample is chosen. One of those is called non-response bias. Now, non-response and voluntary response are two different things. Voluntary response means that people have an opportunity to choose to be in the sample or not. Non-response means that they are in the sample, they are chosen to be in the sample, but they choose not to respond. They either choose not to respond, or they are unable to respond in some way because they can't be reached. Maybe when someone knocks on their door to ask a question, they're not home. Maybe they refuse to open the door. Maybe when the phone rings, they aren't available, or maybe they choose not to answer the phone. But in either way, those are called non-response bias. That is a problem if the people who choose not to respond differ in some important way from people who choose to respond in a way that would affect the response variable. The other type of bias is called response bias. Response bias means that there is something about the way the survey is administered that influences the responses. So, for example, in the Pierre, South Dakota example, a question that I asked first influenced the way you responded to the second question. So this may be a previous question influences the next. It could have to do with wording of the question. If you ask something about, do you think our greedy government should raise do you think our government should raise taxes in order to take money from hardworking Americans and give it to people who are lazy and don't want to work? You know, that's definitely a loaded question versus, do you think wealthy people should be required to give a portion of their money to help those less fortunate? If you asked it that way, that's going to give a different response than the first way. So the wording of the question makes a big difference. Another one is the interviewer. If I wanted to know your opinions about Covenant Christian High School and I asked you myself as a teacher, you might respond differently than if a friend asked you the same question, one of your peers. So the interviewer can have a big influence on the response to the question. Another one is the presence can't spell it. The presence of other people. So maybe a bunch of people are taking a survey. Well, if you can hear what other people are answering, it might influence your responses. So it's better that when you're giving a survey that you make sure that no one overhears other people's responses. I was just thinking of another one. What is it? The other one might be face-to-face versus anonymous. So if you can ask, especially if you have a potentially sensitive topic. So maybe you're asking someone, have you ever stolen anything? Or have you ever cheated on a test? Or have you ever committed this crime? You know, whatever it is that somebody would not want to admit. Have you ever cheated on your taxes or anything like that? If a person has the opportunity to respond anonymously, they might be truthful, but if they have to say it face to face to someone, they might not be honest. Now, of course, you can always have people who will not take surveys seriously. They'll just goof around and give you stupid answers and things like that. But these are the main issues that you have with response bias. So when you are talking about bias, you want to make sure to talk about what sort of bias might happen and look at the main idea. You know, there might be more than one possibility in a situation, but look at the big problem. What's probably the most glaring problem with this sample or this survey, and then talk about how that type of bias might reflect the variable that's being measured in the survey or the study, which is called the response variable.